Learning Seat and People Stream, in collaboration with Landry and Roger Lawyers, welcome you to our new webinar, Whistleblowing, What You Need to Know. For any questions that need answering, please type these into the Q&A chat window. These questions will be answered as we go, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. As mentioned on the opening slide, the webinar will be emailed to all attendees. Thank you for taking 30 minutes out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar. We hope you will find it both educational and informative.
In breaking news, a 32-year-old mother of two was detained earlier today for questioning in relation to multiple counts of fraud.
It's up to the organisation to make sure there's nothing, that people can do wrong.
Any kind of corrupt behaviour, I'd be happy to blow the whistle on.
Smith did the right thing. He smelt a rat and took all the right steps to do something about it.
Hang on a second. What do you mean by that?
Obtaining a benefit for yourself or someone else through false or deceptive means.
They look so normal, we just don't suspect these things.
Our speaker today is Paul Fowler, who is Special Counsel at Landry and Rogers Lawyers. Paul has significant prosecutorial and defence experience, principally in criminal, regulatory defence and work health and safety law. Prior to working at Landry and Rogers, Paul was a senior lawyer at the Victorian Office of Public Prosecutions and WorkSafe Victoria. With a career that spans over 13 years, Paul's technical, commercial and strategic thinking assist him to better understand his clients and their desired outcomes. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
No problems, Cameron.
And co-hosting with me, Cameron Boucher from Learning Seat, is Kim Densham from People Stream. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Cameron. Hi, everybody. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Kim.
Again, if you have any questions during the webinar, please enter these via the Q&A window. Fact. Almost 2/3 of public sector workers state they've seen serious wrongdoing occur in the workplace. Incredibly though, less than 1/3 actually report it. In this webinar, we will discuss what are the Australian whistleblower laws and who administers them, examples of some high-profile whistleblowing cases, key objectives of the public disclosure laws, including whistleblower protections, the role of employees and employers in the context of whistleblowing, measures to prevent or minimise the impact of corrupt, improper or illegal conduct in your organisation. Now would probably be an apt time for me to hand over to yourself, Paul.
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you to Learning Seat and People Stream for facilitating this event, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to give a very high-level overview of the new public interest disclosure laws, also known as the whistleblowing laws. We're going to be covering the key concepts and provide some practical tips for you at the end of the day. I'd like to conduct this fairly informally, so if you have any questions, please shoot them through to the Learning Seat and People Stream team, and we'll answer those as we go along. But we only have a short time, so I'll press on with the presentation. Local government is a tough gig, there's no doubt about that. People are often quick to criticise local governments, but forget that they have a very broad remit in terms of what they administer. They have large workforces, they manage diverse assets and services, they're interfacing with a host of regulators and other statutory authorities, contractors, suppliers, and sometimes federal and state governments as well. Obviously, councils, being large organisations for the large part, can be dysfunctional, as can a lot of large organisations. But local government is also very highly regulated, and they're also bound to observe a huge range of legislation, and one of those pieces of legislation is the Public Interest Disclosure Acts. They also have a large degree of accountability for their ratepayers. They also need to be very transparent through council meetings. They have oversight from various ombudsmen and also the state local government authorities such as Walga in WA. Some councils are also very powerful by virtue of state governments delegating their authority to make laws, like the WA and Queensland councils. So with all of these powers comes responsibility, accountability and transparency. So just to give you an overview of the statutory framework of the Public Interest Disclosure Acts, there is a Commonwealth and state and territory-based regimes. I won't focus on the Commonwealth regime so much today because the state-based regimes apply to local councils. But the Commonwealth legislation is interesting in that it has extraterritorial effects, so that's decisions that are made overseas, and interestingly a number of exceptions are made in terms of who it applies to, such as various ministers and the like. Basically, the new Public Interest Disclosure Acts have repealed the old whistleblower laws and have amended the Ombudsman Acts, and basically they provide wide-ranging changes largely born out of concerns ranging from an increase in corruption in the public sector, but also through a lack of robustness through internal and external processes, as well as a lack of awareness of whistleblowing laws previously. Another concern was that the protections to whistleblowers were inadequate, so those have been improved through these new laws. In relation to the new public interest disclosure laws, the main changes have included who can make a public interest disclosure, which public bodies are bound by the legislation, what constitutes a public interest disclosure, and the public bodies who can receive and deal with public interest disclosures. Importantly as well, there's increased penalties for the public bodies who don't protect whistleblowers, most notably in the Northern Territory, where there's fines of $52,000 or 2 years jail, which is quite substantial. So let's just focus briefly on some of the key concepts of the legislation, the who, what, where and why. So who can make a public interest disclosure? Well, this varies across the jurisdictions. It can be a current or former public official, and that applies to the Commonwealth and New South Wales jurisdictions. In terms of a former public official, there's no time frame set on that, so it'll be interesting to see what sort of case law comes out of that. Also, any person can make a public interest disclosure in the ACT, the Northern Territory and Queensland in limited circumstances, Victoria and South Australia as well. But in South Australia, any person who's directly affected by a decision can make a public interest disclosure, so that's very broad. And also Tasmania has its own version where a public officer or even a contractor of that public officer or public authority can make a public interest disclosure. So again, broadening that concept out. Importantly, public interest disclosure can only be made if that person has a reasonable belief that the information is capable of being a public interest disclosure. So that is something too that will be tested if the matter does go external. In terms of a public interest disclosure, what is it? Well, there's no uniform definition across the Australian jurisdictions, but as a general proposition, it's people who I've just described, can make a disclosure about improper conduct or wrongdoing by public bodies and public officers, i.e. councils and councillors, to prescribed internal officers of that organisation or to external regulators such as the prescribed ombudsman or IBAC here in Victoria or ICAC in New South Wales. There are also other bodies who may also receive public interest disclosures, and for instance in Western Australia the Public Sector Commission in WA can receive those disclosures. So what is the type of improper or disclosable conduct that's captured by the legislation? Well, basically, again, it varies across jurisdictions, but generally it covers corrupt conduct, maladministration, misuse of public money, bribes, kickbacks and secret commissions, breaches of public trust, and in relation to the local government context, local government pecuniary interest contraventions, and that's covered specifically in the New South Wales legislation. Importantly, it doesn't include, and this is contained in the various legislation, disagreement with policy, if the public interest disclosure is made to avoid disciplinary action or it's a grievance. So that sort of touches on the malicious making of public interest disclosures. So which public bodies and officers can receive public interest disclosures? Again, the legislation is very prescriptive and it details which bodies can receive these disclosures. But obviously the legislation includes councils and council employees or local government authorities, which is what we're concerned with today. The legislation also covers the circumstance of lodging a disclosure, and that can relate to internal lodging of disclosures or external lodging of disclosures, and in some instances it allows for those disclosures to be made to media as well. But those disclosures can't be made to media in a deliberate or malicious sense, and in some instances can only be made after a certain time has elapsed or an internal investigation process has been exhausted. Protections. Now this is a very important part of the presentation. Integral to promoting whistleblowing or making public interest disclosures is ensuring that whistleblowers are protected against reprisals or detrimental action. Now, detrimental action or reprisals can take many forms. For instance, the person could be dismissed or their disclosure could result in disciplinary action. They could be bullied, harassed or discriminated against, either directly or indirectly. They could suffer injury, damage or loss as a result of making the disclosure. But also, importantly too, if there's an internal investigation process, those protections extend to witnesses who provide evidence of in relation to a whistleblowing instance. So it extends quite broadly. Critical to this is that a whistleblower who comes forward and makes a legitimate public interest disclosure has immunity from civil and criminal liability. That's not an absolute protection. That pertains to whether they have breached a confidence or they have potentially defamed someone. If they have been involved in criminal conduct themselves, they aren't afforded protection in that context. So that won't excuse their conduct. It's not a blanket protection. Whistleblowers can also seek injunctive relief from the federal court if reprisals or detrimental action has been taken. This is quite an involved process where you need to put in lodge documentation supporting that application, which is very involved and very expensive, but if the reprisals are quite severe and loss and damage is being suffered, that's one avenue that you might want to explore. As I touched on earlier, the penalties for reprisals can be made against individuals or even the public bodies who fail to protect their employees are quite stiff. As I mentioned, the Northern Territory has the most onerous regime, followed by Western Australia, which has fines of $24,000 and 2 years jail. And importantly too, in a civil sense, if a public authority allows a reprisal to occur and they don't take reasonable action to prevent that from happening, then they might be vicariously liable as well. So that's something to bear in mind down the track. The legislation also deals with malicious or false reporting of reprisals for ulterior motives, getting back at people where people know the allegation to be false. As I said, that is covered in the legislation, and also that might also constitute criminal conduct as well. And also, in addition to the Public Interest Disclosure Acts, whistleblowers are protected in other legislation in the public sphere by virtue of the Fair Work Act and also work health and safety legislation, where people who raise safety concerns, it's not permissible to discriminate against those people for raising a safety concern or assisting an inspector or the like. So there are other avenues of protection there. Turning to some of the practical cases, looking at thinking about the international arena, no doubt many of you are familiar with the higher profile cases involving Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, where national security and foreign policy issues have been at the fore. But I want to closely look at, in the Australian context, some well-known or maybe not so well-known whistleblowing cases where public officers and public authorities have been involved. The first one is Tony Hoffman and Jayant Patel. Jayant Patel was a surgeon at Bundaberg Public Hospital between 2003 and 2005. During that time he operated on around 867 patients and eventually a Royal Commission was called and investigated 87 deaths out of those 867 patients who died, and a number of who were also wounded as a result of his medical negligence. Tony Hoffman had the courage to come forward. She was an intensive care nurse who raised her concerns with Queensland Health, which eventually got the ball rolling and was escalated into a Royal Commission and eventually resulted in criminal charges, of which Dr Patel is still going through the appeal process. Andrew Wilkie is probably one of the lesser known ones. There was an Australian story on his particular story about raising his concerns with the lack of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in the early 2000s when he was a member of the ADF. His claims more or less fell on deaf ears and he was ostracised, left his job and became a pariah in the defence community before making a return to federal politics sometime later. Kathy Jackson, this is a very topical one at the moment with the Royal Commission into unions occurring at the moment. The CFMEU are getting a lot of attention there. But Kathy Jackson was a senior member of the Health and Services Union, or the HSU, and her exposures led to the jailing of senior leader and former National ALP President Michael Williamson, and she also exposed Craig Thompson, the Federal MP and National Secretary of the HSU, for his inappropriate use of credit cards. So very topical and very much in the news. Whilst Kathy has gone public with her disclosures about the unconscionable conduct of Mr Williamson and also Mr Thompson, it's also shone a light on her own behaviour as well, and sort of polarised opinion about whether she was involved in the improper conduct and wrongdoing and rorting, etc., or in fact she is a whistleblower who has exposed all of this and should be congratulated for bringing it to the fore. So I can show you how polarising whistleblowing behaviour can be. Lastly, in relation to a local government context, ICAC in New South Wales has made specific findings in relation to a number of councils in relation to a particular investigation it held in 2012 where they found that 14 local councils and 22 employees or former employees who have been named and shamed received gifts or engaged in corrupt conduct or received payments totalling $320,000 and was estimated to cost two councils in particular, two larger councils, over $1.5 million. So ICAC and IBAC and organisations like that do name and shame and they publish their findings and have coercive powers to make public bodies play ball with their inquisitorial investigations. Again, focusing on the local government context, these are a number of particular exposures that councils might have that are well known, I'm sure, amongst all of you, where corrupt conduct or improper conduct might occur. And this is across procurement processes, relational selling, that is, parties that are known to one another, gifts that are given against council policy or that aren't disclosed, or inventory management. And that includes surplus or waste product that is used in inappropriate ways. There are numerous case studies on examples of in these sorts of areas. Inappropriate use of council assets or services, i.e. senior members using or living in council properties, forgery or false accounting if you've got paper-based systems, misappropriate use of wastage or surplus goods or services, which I've spoken about, so using surplus building products to use at your home, bribes, kickbacks or secret commissions, pressure or intimidation to fabricate stories or falsify documents. For instance, if internal investigations are going on, people might be nobbled not to provide evidence or versions of events. Gifts and non-disclosure. Councils usually have pretty firm policies on these things, and conflicts of interest as well, which councils, as opposed to the administration parts of council, they need to declare their interests at meetings. They have a register of declarations and pecuniary interests as well, which need to be constantly updated as well, and councils tend to do that pretty well. Just turning to preventative measures, and this has a fair bit of crossover with workplace fraud, which touches on private and public bodies, including councils, but Learning Seed has just also developed a workplace fraud module which will be released shortly. But importantly, and in our experience with clients, the best way to prevent improper conduct is to basically know what constitutes improper conduct under the Act, and to do that you need to have clear written procedures and policies that facilitate the making, handling and notification of protected disclosures, because some protected disclosures may not be protected disclosures at all. They might relate to unethical conduct, which might necessitate some other process being gone through, but may not constitute a public interest disclosure. For instance, here in Victoria, Victorian councils are required to have written procedures in place. When the new Public Interest Disclosure Act came in, councils were required by the 10th of August last year to have appropriate written policies and procedures that identified all the key concepts and also had a process to deal with public interest disclosures. And IBAC, who oversees the legislation, their inspectorate was reviewing those policies and procedures to make sure that they were appropriate. Having those policies and procedures, the critical things that should be included, they should identify when, how and where and the why of public interest disclosures, clearly articulate the internal and external for making disclosures, also spell out what isn't a public interest disclosure in addition to what is, and also clearly articulate what constitutes, I should say, a reasonable belief to form the basis of a public interest disclosure. So it's not just having a vibe, you should have a fair basis for it and have evidence to support the making of that public interest disclosure, particularly if it goes external so you can substantiate your claim. It's critical that there is a responsible person to receive a complaint and also progress a complaint in a timely way. The legislation in some jurisdictions has prescribed timeframes for that to occur, such as 45 days or to finalise it by 6 months or the like. And as I said before, there is a fair bit of crossover here with workplace fraud and the sort of preventative measures that you can put in place to report and identify improper or unlawful conduct, such as auditing, cross-checking, having codes of conduct for internal people or external people such as contractors or suppliers. Policies and training is critical for your people so that the message, the key messages sink in rather than being reactive to things when things have gone wrong. Obviously a gift policy is critical to all of this as well. You might want to think about redesigning your inventory management or procurement processes so it's not paper-based and it goes to an e-procurement type system where the ability to forge or falsify is lessened. And measures like that can go a long way to prevent these things from occurring. Well, that takes me to the close of my presentation, but I'd like to invite you now to send through any or raise any messages with us now, and we can respond to them in the few moments that we have left. Okay, just while we're waiting for those questions to come through, I might relate some of the more common queries that we get, including the interaction of privacy laws and the making of public interest disclosures. Privacy laws are Commonwealth in nature, so they're paramount to state-based legislation. You should always be mindful of the sorts of documents that are protected by privacy laws before that information is handed over. And you might have your own privacy officer within an organisation, so always make sure that any information that's handed over isn't protected by privacy laws. Okay, also too, just to give you a bit of an idea of the types of extremes that some local councils have gone to with these whistleblower laws. We had a situation here in Victoria where two council workers who were direct employees, who weren't contractors, they were sacked, but later reinstated for accepting a couple of steak sandwiches from a local sports club. Because they were on their way to the tip to dump some hot mix, and they filled 2 potholes for the sportsman's club for the elderly patrons. They got the 2 steak sandwiches, and the council, well, someone blew the whistle, the council found out, and they were later sacked. but they were reinstated to their work after the union agitated. I think that's one example of an absolute extreme case of whistleblowing laws, whereas I think the new public interest disclosure laws would say that that's probably going a little bit too far. Well, in the absence of any further questions, I might conclude the session and hand over to Kim and Cameron from Signal Stream and Learning Seat.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate your insights that you shared with us and the audience today. I'd also like to thank Cameron and the team here for putting the process together. I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation, and I would just like to thank you all for joining us today in this session, which is the first in a series of informative knowledge sharing webinars. And over the coming weeks we'll be in touch about the follow-up sessions, which will touch on the state-based whistleblowing specifics. So thanks again to you all for taking time out your busy schedule to join us here today.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks.